The Death Mage Who Doesn't Want a Fourth Time. Chapter 93. The Monster Who Won't Give Up. For the people of the 2nd to 6th cultivation villages, this winter day was an unforgettable day indeed. "I have something important to tell everyone," said the savior of the villages. He was accompanied by the people of the 7th cultivation village and those of the 1st cultivation village, which was supposed to have been deserted, as well as several knights in armor who were tied up and being pulled along. "Everyone, listen to me," Sebas pleaded. "We've all been deceived by the Hartner family. When we became unable to maintain the 1st cultivation village, us villagers were told that we were being sent to a new land to cultivate. We followed them, only to be thrown into the slave-run mine. We had no crimes, no debt, yet we were turned into slaves. Because of the harsh labor we were forced to do in the mine, my father, the village chief, my little sister, and brother as well. There's no difference between the Hartner family and those bastards from the Amid Empire. My Nisan was treated as a plaything by the men. They're nothing but demons." Those from the 1st cultivation village, including Sebas, the village chief's son, spoke of the sorrow they had endured at the slave-run mine. Even though they were from another village, they were friends who had been living in this cultivated land, just like the rest of the villages. Each village had many who recognized their faces. The other villagers got the feeling that the color of their eyes was a bit different, but that was within acceptable limits of error. Thus, no matter how difficult it was to believe their words, it was impossible to completely reject them. And Lord Lucas, who is about to become in charge of the Hartner duchy, tried to destroy this cultivation project. "Come on, talk," Sebas said to Pablo, who had been captured alive. Pablo gave a groan before revealing everything, except for the details regarding Froto, the fake priest sent by Karkan. "My body, even my mouth, moves against my will. Why in the world?" Vandalou had used spirit form transformation, split his claws into string-thin parts that extended to the knights who had been captured alive, and then used materialization inside their bodies. He was secreting various drugs from his claws in real time, forcing them into a state where they could not remain silent. But thanks to the numerous resistance skills that existed in Lambda, it was possible to resist the effects of drugs in ways that were scientifically impossible. "It's best to give up. You people don't want to end up like Kinarp, do you?" Vandalou whispered to them, ensuring that they did not regain their willpower and strength. He was also using his mental encroachment skill to inflict mental damage on them, while slowly injecting more venom into them, little by little, and this was slowly beginning to take effect. I am Pablo Martin, the captain of the Red Wolf Knights Order. In order to have Lucas-sama succeed the Duke family, I created secret plans and ordered my subordinates to sabotage the cultivation villages." Hearing Pablo's confession and seeing the crest on the armor that he was wearing, the trust the villagers of the cultivation villages had in the Hartner duchy plummeted to the ground. The concept of human rights was underdeveloped in Lambda, and those of royal or noble status were considered to be like a superior race to commoners. With that said, commoners still felt anger and dissatisfaction when trampled underfoot for absurd reasons. However, even if they did feel anger and dissatisfaction, there was a difference in power that prevented them from doing anything about it. It was meaningless for poor people living in cultivation villages to even think about opposing the Hartner family, who essentially ruled an entire nation. But there was no guarantee that they could keep living quietly like this. The next duke had dispatched a knight's order and demanded impossible amounts to be paid in taxes, and then told the villagers to tie ropes on themselves and become slaves because they had been unable to pay. It was difficult to imagine that the Hartner family would stay silent after the knight's order had been repelled, and the villagers couldn't just hope for the Hartner family to change its way of thinking. If they were going to be turned into slaves, didn't they have no choice but to run away and become bandits or something? Vandalou whispered to the sorrowful villagers.
I'm sure you can no longer live in the Hartner duchy. If you don't mind, won't you all come with me, like Sebas and the others have?
Us survivors from the first cultivation village are all living under his rule, Sebas continued. We're living rich lives in a place where even the Hartner family can't touch us. We're eating until our stomachs are full every day, and there's even work for us to do. The villagers stirred, and their eyes shone with hope. Chief, me and my family are going to follow this child, said Kine, the hunter from the 5th cultivation village. Other villagers who had been directly saved by Vandalou, just like Kine, raised their voices. The village leaders thought about the offer and then came to a decision. All right, everyone, we must make preparations. This place could not become our second home. I'm sure that it will be difficult to start over again, but we have the guardian of the cultivation villages with us. We can make a new beginning anywhere. Isn't that right? Vandalou repeated this process for all of the cultivation villages. And so it was decided that over 1,000 villagers would migrate to Talosheim. The villagers who were now receiving the benefits of Vandalou's Strengthened Followers skill were working away to prepare for their migration. The Red Wolf Knight's order had been carrying messenger pigeons to contact Lord Lucas, but they had been seized as well.
Now then, please write that everything is in order, Vandalou requested. I don't recommend that you include a secret code to tell them that there's an emergency situation, he added. They probably won't make it in time anyway, but if by some chance they do, I have no choice but to do what I have to do in order to protect everyone. That would be bad for you, wouldn't it?
Pablo showed no signs of resistance. Even he knew that the Hartner duchy would suffer the least damage if Vandalou and the others simply left. Things might be different if the 5-colored blades came, but they were adventurers, nothing more. They were unlikely to move in order to match Lord Lucas's needs. And the mastermind of all of this was a Dampier. The ones who had been acting unreasonably were Pablo and his men. Even if the Adventurers Guild learned of the situation, they were unlikely to side with the knights, who were the ones who had carried out injustice. The Adventurers Guild probably wouldn't cause any direct trouble in the Hartner duchy, though, unlike the monstrosity before Pablo's eyes. "What are you thinking? Why are you doing such a thing?" Pablo asked Vandalou, the fearsome monstrosity in the form of a child. What Vandalou had done in this incident was different to repelling Karkan's men, who had disguised themselves as bandits. Unlike Karkan and his men, Pablo and his knights had been clearly recognizable as the Red Wolf Knights Order, and announced that they had come under formal orders from Lord Lucas, who represented Duke Hartner. Despite that, Vandalou had incited the villagers, used military power to resist, and slaughtered all of the knights except for a few. If this incident were to be discovered, the people might praise Vandalou, but a bounty would be put on his head for treason, and he would be hunted all over the nation. If he was caught, he wouldn't simply become a criminal slave. He would be unable to avoid execution. That was how serious Vandalou's crime was. Why would he risk all of that to save the people of the cultivation villages? The rewards simply didn't justify the risks. Considering the dirty methods that Vandalou had used, Pablo could not imagine that he had been driven by a sense of justice. So just why had he done this? Pablo's questions were not an attempt to negotiate or gather information. The monstrosity before his eyes was simply so incomprehensible that he couldn't help but ask. For the sake of my own happiness. The response Pablo received was also beyond his understanding. For the sake of your happiness, how does saving them lead to your happiness? He asked. Pablo could not imagine that Vandalou stood to gain much here. Just what would he be able to do after gathering a group of poor cultivation villagers who had nobody supporting them? Even if he turned all of them into vampires, it was unlikely that this was worth the risk of opposing the Orbomb Kingdom.
Why do you doubt that saving everyone will lead to my happiness? Vandalou asked.
It seemed that he couldn't understand Pablo's doubt either.
I was simply passing by, and there were people who were in trouble, so I helped them a little. Those people were happy, and I became happy as well. And then, while I was helping them a little, we became close to each other and I made friends. And then people came to try and kill those friends and use dirty methods to take everything from them. So I helped them a little, once more. Is it really that strange?
This was the only reason Vandalou had for being an ally of the cultivation villages. As a result, he had acquired the title Guardian of the Cultivation Villages, but that was merely a result that followed everything else. It is said that even chance meetings are due to fate, and good you do to others is good you do to yourself. Vandalou did have a little self-interest in mind, but if he were the kind of person who would consider wanting the villagers to be happy to be a detestable ulterior motive, he never would have gotten involved with other people to begin with. It just so happened that Vandalou's idea of a little was relatively large. He had the fighting ability to light-heartedly dispose of goblin barbarians, orcs, and bandits. He had the magic and mana to light-heartedly treat the injured and sick, remove the poison contaminating the fields, and dig a well. Vandalou hated the idea of the responsibility of those with power, but he wouldn't detest helping people a little out of kindness. In other words, this was normal.
How can you give such a stupid excuse? For such a trivial reason you turned us, the Hartner Duchy, into your enemies? It's even possible for the entire kingdom to turn on you,
Pablo shouted, seemingly unable to accept this answer.
Well, for such a trivial reason you have all been exterminated, said Vandalou.
Pablo's eyes widened as he fell into silence.
Won't this person's eyeballs fly out of their socket if he keeps this up?
Vandalou thought as he continued speaking.
The misunderstanding that I don't want you to make is the assumption that I didn't intend to make the Hartner family my enemy from the beginning, he said. You people did a lot of things to others, so I simply did some things back.
A lot of things, you say?
Pablo wondered if Vandalou was referring to Karkan's reckless behavior, but he was wrong.
Your ancestors murdered titans from Talosheim, including Princess Levia, and sent the rest of the refugees to become slaves in a mine. Even after 200 years passed, you did not stop treating them as slaves. That's why I released the spirits of Princess Levia and the others, and rescued the refugees from the mines. You people had connections to the pure-breed vampires, so I revealed that. You people tried to destroy the cultivation villages, so I stopped you from doing that. You people caused everything. I simply acted in response.
What? Then all of the incidents that have been happening?
Yes, I am the main culprit.
This wasn't something that was easy to believe, but the monstrosity before Pablo's eyes had already accomplished a great number of unbelievable things. Pablo had been unaware of the conspiracy that had occurred 200 years ago, but he could imagine that the Duke Hartner back then had started something. In fact, Pablo and his men had been trying to do similar in the cultivation villages, so it would have been stranger to think that the Duke's family of the past had not started anything.
Demon,
Pablo muttered.
Demon?
Vandalou repeated. He was bewildered. He didn't understand why he was being called a demon.
Yes, you're a demon, said Pablo. It would be stranger if you were not a demon. What you have done to the people you say you are protecting is not what can be considered sane. You turned the slaves you rescued into vampires, produced insects and plants from your body one after another, fanned the fires of anger and dissatisfaction the people felt for the Hartner Duchy, spoke pleasant words to them, incited them against us. And why have the people of the cultivation villages, who have seen the countless monsters and those who have transformed into vampires serving you, accepted that so easily? He demanded.
Perhaps because everybody is open-minded?
Vandalou suggested.
There's no way that's possible. You're manipulating them, aren't you? Pablo shouted.
No, really, I have no idea, said Vandalou. Though I do think that everyone is very open-minded.
None of the people of the cultivation villages felt any apprehension about the fact that Sebes and the others had been turned into subordinate vampires by Eleonora, or the fact that Vandalou used insectoid-type and plant-type monsters, especially those of the 7th cultivation village. Vandalou had thought it strange, as Death Attribute Charm was not affecting them, but hadn't read too much into it, assuming that it was because they were believers of Vida, the same assumption he had made with Gopher and the other Titan refugees. The truth was that it was the effect of the Strengthened Followers skill. The moment the people of the cultivation villages chose to follow Vandalou, they had become his followers. They felt a sense of familiarity and unity with Sebes and the other vampires, as well as Pete and the rest of the monsters, because they were all Vandalou's followers as well. The Strengthened Followers skill was not a skill that was supposed to work on members of other races, so nobody, not even Vandalou himself, knew this. However, even if Vandalou was aware of this, he probably wouldn't think of it as a bad thing.
Well, I do admit that I stirred them up and instigated them, but is that a bad thing? Vandalou asked. After all, right after you people tried to slaughter everyone in the cultivation villages, you tried to force the unreasonable demands on them and turn them into slaves, intending to kill them if they disobeyed, didn't you?
That is, Karkan, you people.
You people are responsible for Karkan, so this was simply our response.
As Pablo looked at Vandalou, his vision blurred. His cold sweat, had dripped into his eyes. He had decided that the Dhampir in front of him was a monstrosity after all. Vandalou was speaking logically and politely. In fact, even Pablo felt like Vandalou had a point. But, looking at Vandalou's eyes, Pablo knew it. He knew that a monstrosity was before him. This monstrosity showed no hesitation to defy the absolute authority of the Hartner Duchy. He wasn't a champion of justice or a hero for the refugees. He was a demon who tempted people. Demons in fairy tales tempted people extremely kindly, and then they would guide the people on a path of evil.
By the way, are you almost finished? Vandalou asked.
Pablo was startled by the question. He wondered what just kind of conversation he had been having with this demon. He hadn't been negotiating or gathering information, so was it just idle talk? Impossible. It wasn't as calm as that. Every time he had opened his mouth, he had been staring at the monstrosity before his eyes with more and more interest, hadn't he? The monstrosity stood up from the log he had been sitting on, and his claws drew close to Pablo.
For some reason, I am told that I'm insane, so I wanted to try talking to a normal person who is in a completely opposite position to mine, said Vandalou. There were many points that I could understand. I felt like I did most of the talking in the end, but the time that I spent on this conversation was very valuable.
What are you planning to do? What will become of me? Asked Pablo.
Please provide my apprentice with more valuable time as a guinea pig, said Vandalou. Don't worry, it will be over much quicker than the time I spent as a guinea pig.
The moment Pablo thought he felt a liquid dripping onto his face, his consciousness blacked out.
The level of the grotesque mind skill has increased.
Immediately after, a messenger pigeon delivered a message that read, "Nothing abnormal, everything is in order." Contact with the Red Wolf Knight's order ceased. Spies were sent to investigate. What they found were empty cultivation villages and traces of a large number of people moving south. Lord Lucas sent more spies to learn more details, but they didn't gain any solid information at all. He tried hiring a capable spiritualist who is said to be living in Nearchy, but it seemed that she had already closed shop and either moved to another duchy or back to the elf village where she was born. In the city that was abandoned, or rather forced to be abandoned 200 years ago, in a place a short distance away from the cultivation villages, a small-scale dungeon with a single floor had appeared. Also, the tunnel that led to the southern region of the continent where Talosheim was should have been impossible to pass through as it had collapsed. But there were traces that the boulder at its entrance had moved. These were the only things that the spies were able to learn. Could it be that all of these events were caused by someone who crawled into the duchy from Talosheim? In spring, Lucas shuddered when he saw this report. He had formally succeeded the Hartner family. Of course, now that he had become the Duke, he knew of the absurd betrayal his predecessor had committed 200 years ago. Royalty and nobles created all kinds of enemies and allies through all sorts of methods. But when a new individual took over the family's headship, it was common for them to set the previous generation's deeds aside and mend previous relationships. There were some cases where a predecessor had said that certain families should never be forgiven, but even then reconciliation usually happened a few generations later. But grudges of other races, especially those with long lifespans, were different. Even if the humans had changed generations, the other races' individuals were often still alive. Titans had lifespans of 300 years, and although this news arrived late, the spies that the Hartner family had sent into the Amid Empire delivered information to Lucas that an expedition army of 6,000 men sent by the Merg Shield Nation into the continent's southern region had returned as a swarm of thousands of undead. There was something in Talosheim, and that was something deeply malicious towards the Hartner family. There was no doubting that. Lucas had no way of knowing how that something was related to the cultivation villages, however. He didn't know that it was simply because the cultivation villages were close to Talosheim. The appearance of small-scale dungeons, the religion of Vita spreading among the farming villages, all of it is the doing of that someone, Lord Lucas murmured. Curse you, ancestors. Thanks to you, the Hartner family has earned the hatred of a monstrosity. Lord Lucas announced that the Red Wolf Knights Order had moved to exterminate disaster-designated monster races that had settled into the ruins of the slave-run mine, where all of the men under Pablo's command had lost their lives in exchange for those of the monsters. He also announced that the cultivation villages had been unable to be saved. And then he decided to build a fort in the city of Nearchy to be prepared to fight the monster to the south of the continent. Incidentally, around this time, the Five-Colored Blades were investigating the small-scale dungeons when they ran into and defeated some vampires who had come to do some investigating as well. With the information they gained from these vampires, they followed the trail of the pure-breed vampire Ternesia and left the Hartner Duchy.
Vandalou has gained the monstrosity title.
Pan-fried gyoza, boiled gyoza, steamed meat dumplings, steamed buns, takoyaki, okonomiyaki, taiyaki, yakitori, hot dogs, frankfurters, kebabs, Cuban sandwiches, fresh spring rolls, chapati with meat, fish and vegetables, waffles, crepes, sherbet, fruit juice, hornworm skewers. All kinds of food that could be found at food stands on Earth and in Origin were lined up, ready to be eaten. With this food in front of them, everyone's eyes sparkled as if they had laid eyes on some high-class dishes, and then they cheered.
Wonderful! I've never seen any of these dishes before. I can't hold back anymore. Itadakimasu!
And then they began eating with an intense vigor. Talosheim's usual members, with the addition of Luciliano, Cassim, Fester, Zeno, and Lena, were here to enjoy the food. The dishes had been cooked by the craftsmen who had migrated from the cultivation village. Everyone was taking the food from plates one after another and eating them as if in a frenzy, even though they were not being pressed to eat quickly. "This gyoza! There are meat and vegetables inside? What juicy bread! I see it's so delicious because the ingredients are wrapped in this thin bread."
Even gyoza is considered bread in Lambda, I see, Vandalou noted.
"Hey, bearded old man, this stir-fried bread called soba with vegetables and seafood is delicious," said Kasim. "Those people from the country called Earth are pretty clever to think of stir-frying bread together with other ingredients." Kasim-kun, I'm still in my 20s, Luciliano said indignantly, "and that is not bread, they're called noodles." "Cotton," Fester repeated. "They're made of cotton? Cotton is edible, huh?" Translator's note: cotton and noodles are both pronounced the same in Japanese.
"Fester, it's good, so eat it. If you don't, your question can't be answered, can it?" said Lena.
"This round one is—"
It's hot, but it's good. There's something creamy inside of it. This fresh bread is hot. Oh, it's sweet? Why is a bread with fish sweet?"
Zeno shouted.
"Zeno, where has your usual composure gone?"
It seemed that the food was well received by Talosheim's new citizens. Braga, Eleonora, Zadiris, and the others, who were already accustomed to eating this food, were also enjoying it.
"The taste is different this time, but it's still delicious," said Eleonora. "Yes, it seems that the takoyaki is filled with jam, and the yakisoba sauce is tare made with fruit and spices rather than soy sauce and mayonnaise," Zadiris observed.
There were many dishes that were not difficult to reproduce as long as the method of making them were known and the ingredients were gathered. As for the necessary cookware, Vandalou could make as many as was needed, as he was able to freely change the shape of wood and metal with golem transmutation. He did have to work hard to make the equipment required to make Cuban sandwiches, which were made by putting ingredients between two buns and cooking it from both above and below, and kebabs, which were made by wrapping slices of meat into a cylindrical shape.
"So, what do you think?"
Vandalou asked.
"If I continued selling these for 3 months at a food stall, do you think the Commerce Guild would accept it?"
He had not given up on becoming an adventurer, but he thought that he would have to use a bit of a roundabout method to do so. That roundabout method was to register at the Commerce Guild. When he registered at the Adventurers Guild, his status would be inspected, but Kasim and his friends knew of a way to avoid this, by presenting the registration card of another guild. The Commerce Guild, Mages Guild, Workers Guild, any guild would do. If he already had a registration card of another guild, that meant his social status had already been checked. And then Vandalou would be able to have his own guild card made without having his status looked at by the guild employee. Incidentally, Darcia, Katya, and Borkus hadn't known of this registration method. The Adventurers Guild was the guild that was easiest to register at, so there was never a need to use such a roundabout method. Kasim and his friends had only learned of it through the only son of a traveling merchant, whom they had met at the adventurer training school. They had remembered that this person had said, "I showed them my Commerce Guild registration card, so they didn't have to take my blood." Incidentally, that only son of a traveling merchant had registered at the Adventurers Guild, not because he had been trying to seriously become an adventurer, but because the adventurer training school was the cheapest way to learn to defend himself. Vandalou had chosen the Commerce Guild as the guild he would register at before registering at the Adventurers Guild. This food sampling feast was to get everyone's opinions on whether the food could be used to sell in order to fulfill the Commerce Guild's registration requirement of conducting business.
"I'm sure it will sell. There's no way something this delicious wouldn't sell," said Borkus.
"Oyaji, bits of food are falling out the other side of your mouth," Gopher told him.
"We agree," said Sam.
"I'm sure they will sell, Bochan," said Rita.
"I know you're not using miso or soy sauce so that they don't stand out, but I think there won't be a problem," said Vigaro. There might be some who prefer it like this.
The reason he had not used things like miso, soy sauce, and mayonnaise was because it would become problematic if the Church of Alda learned that these flavorings were being used. It probably wouldn't become such a severe issue in the Orbaum Kingdom, but people with extreme opinions existed everywhere. It would be problematic for Vandalou to get involved with such people before he even entered society.
Oh, sweet, Rehapisage groaned.
It is delicious. I'm sure everyone will buy them.
Still, it was a relief that the food was quite popular, though. It is indeed delicious to the point of being emotionally moving, said Luciliano, who had experienced receiving special requests for him by name from multiple noblemen and wealthy merchants. However, he was wearing a difficult expression. But there is a problem with selling it at stalls, master, he said.
Why?
Fester asked, before Vandalou could even respond.
It's so delicious, I'll definitely buy it.
How much would you buy it for? Luciliano asked in turn.
How much, you say? That's...
Yes, the problem is the price, said Luciliano.
For example, this gyoza. These ingredients that are seasoned with these spices are expensive. The same goes for the steamed meat dumplings and the meat buns. The yakisoba is also full of luxurious ingredients. The kebabs and hot dogs. There's even butter in the Cuban sandwiches. Takoyaki uses a lot of oil. Okonomiyaki requires fresh seafood. Taiyaki needs jam and honey. There's an abundance of expensive flavors. No, it doesn't really matter if he sells it cheap, does he? Vandalou's objective is to register at the guild, not to make a profit, Cassim pointed out. It's not like he's struggling to make a living.
It was true that Vandalou was not trying to make a living out of his food stand's sales, nor did he actually need to make a profit. In fact, what he wanted was to be conducting a business, so he wouldn't care at all if he made a loss. But Luciliano thought differently. That is a naive way of thinking, he said. If one sold dishes like this at a price that is clearly below the market, at a price that the masses can afford, what would the owners of the other stores think?
No matter how I think about it, I get the feeling that it'll cause trouble, said Cassim.
Exactly, said Luciliano.
Relationships with people are troublesome, aren't they? Then how about doing business in towns and villages that don't have any food stalls? Vandalou suggested.
Master, I do not believe there would be a commerce guild in such places, said Luciliano.
There isn't any need to be a big success, so can't you just make and sell the same thing as the other food stands? Lena suggested. But it will hurt my conscience to make bad food and take money for it, said Vandalou.
Lena's suggestion was quite a safe option, but Vandalou felt opposed to it. Lambda's stall food typically didn't taste very good. Of course, it was true that Vandalou was picky with his food. The amount and affordability normally took priority over the taste, and it was important to be able to make it quickly with a limited amount of working space, so it wasn't very delicious. Wouldn't it be better to set up a permanent store rather than a food stand? Luciliano suggested. The food that you make, master, is all things that even members of royalty and noble families would eat.
The image I had of royalty and nobles has crumbled again, said Vandalou.
He felt dizzy just imagining dressed-up, wealthy men and women having a banquet, giving elegant laughs of hoo-hoo-hoo-hoo and ho-ho-ho-ho as they conversed over yakisoba and takoyaki.
Once I decide on a place to set up business, I suppose I'll examine the prices of things being sold there before coming to a decision. Either way, I won't be able to do business until I get rid of some of the pure-breed vampires, so it will be some time in the future, said Vandalou.
By the way, Van, why is your physical body lying down and not moving? Asked Bastia, who had noticed that the physical Vandalou was lying face down in the corner of the room, completely still.
That is the one in charge of handling the depressing thoughts, replied the spirit form Vandalou. Who is the one who called me monstrosity? If I find them, I'll stick my claws in their ears and make their teeth rattle.